that just captures the attention of our entire. First time I remember seeing that was the O.J. Simpson case, and then it was the Casey Anthony trial, and the other one that you'll probably remember is the Cyrus McCormick trial. You don't remember the Cyrus McCormick trial? Well, it happened in 1840, so some of you are pretty young. You might not remember the details, and it happened in Chicago. And it was very different. It wasn't a murder trial like the other two. It was something that today wouldn't interest very many people at all. Cyrus McCormick had invented a certain piece of farm machinery, and this was a patent case. They were trying to decide if other people could make that same machinery without violating the patent. So if it was done today, there would probably be, a dozen people in the whole country who would be concerned about it. But back then, in our agricultural society, it affected millions of people, and it was a big, big trial. So both sides gathered what is now called the Dream Team, the best lawyers they could get, and most of them came from the Ivy League. And most of them were used to arguing cases on the East Coast. But this case was going to be tried in Chicago, which in those days was just sort of a frontier town, and most of these folks didn't know anybody in Chicago, especially the judges. So they decided, one of the teams was led by a rather well-known attorney named Edwin Stanton, who would become much more famous later on. And he decided that they needed to get a local attorney who was familiar with this judge. And so they found this small-town attorney who had actually worked with the judge before. It had a good reputation, and they asked him to join this Dream Team. So this group of heavyweight Ivy League-trained lawyers came out to Chicago in their finest dress and in their just looking like Ivy League lawyers. And they met this small-town attorney who was to join them, and they were absolutely mortified by what they saw. This man was a mess. His dress was sloppy, his hair was unkempt, and worse than that, when he opened his mouth, he had this real country accent that put him off. It sounded uneducated and unsophisticated to these Ivy League lawyers. And they really were afraid that if he was representing, joining their team and in the court, that he might cost them the case. So they actually did their best to sort of ditch this fellow. Edwin Stanton once, in a loud voice, loud enough for this man to hear, said, "Let's get rid of this ape." And they actually did that. They would meet together for lunch and not invite him to come. They would tell him the wrong times for the court cases, and he would show up at court, and the case would already be finished. Well, they went on and they won the case anyway. And Edwin Stanton became very well known. In fact, about 20 years later, he was appointed the Secretary of War during the Civil War. And the person who appointed him to that position was that country bumpkin attorney that he had called an ape. We know him as Abraham Lincoln. The one that they thought was the most insignificant person on the team, the smallest member of the team, became far more significant than than any of the rest of them. God has this wonderful way of doing this all throughout the Bible, and he continues to do this, to take ordinary people and do extraordinary things, to take the least likely person and to elevate them to honor. No, most of us are not rich or famous. Let's be a little more clear. None of us are rich or famous, okay? I don't want to offend any of you, but I think you know that. We don't have any celebrities here in the group, so we can talk honestly about that. We're just common folks, ordinary folks. And somebody once said, God must have loved common people because he made so many of them. And he likes to use common, ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The problem is that many people think that you have to be famous to be significant. There's just a tiny minority of people who ever make it to that position of being famous. You know that every single year in our country, 500,000 young men play high school basketball all over the country. 500,000 young men try out, and not to mention all the girls who play basketball on girls' teams, but 500,000 young men play. You know, out of that 500,000, only 3%, about 1,500, go on and play in the NCAA, play in college. But out of that, only about 450 play in the NBA. It's like 1 out of 1,000, less than 1 out of 1,000 that start off playing basketball. And by the way, at that point, when they all start off playing, many of them have dreams of playing in the NBA. Many of them have dreams of winning the slam dunk contest and being famous and being interviewed. But only less than 1 out of 1,000 will even make it to the NBA. And then, of course, just a small number of those will be in that top echelon and be famous. But here's the good news. You don't have to be famous to be significant. Fame does not equal significance. And there are many examples of this in the Bible, but one of my favorites is Ruth. We're going to take a look at the life of Ruth and the first few verses in the book of Ruth, and we're going to see a woman who chose obscurity. She chose to lower herself and to be a servant, and we're going to look at how she did that. And I believe she can be a great role model for all of us who live our lives in obscurity, who do small things and wonder if they're important at all in God's eyes. So we're going to start in Ruth chapter 1. We're going to look at the first 18 verses. And just so you know the context, this took place about 1,000 years before Christ was born. And it begins with these words. It says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." So this puts it in context for us, because in the history of the Bible, there was a time in Israel's history when they didn't have any leaders. There was no king. It was before King Saul and King David and Solomon. There were no identified leaders. And this was a time called Judges, and there is a book of Judges in the Old Testament. And one of the themes that was repeated over and over again in the book of Judges is everyone did what is right in their own eyes. Don't you think that describes America today? Not only is there a lack of leaders in our country, but everybody does what's right in their own eyes. And that's what happened back in the book of Judges. And that was the setting into which Ruth came. It says in the days when the judges ruled. So it was before King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and all these things took place. And it says there was a famine in the land. And that famine was severe. It wasn't just that they didn't have great crops. They had no crops. They was so bad that people had to leave Israel just for their own survival. And so you're going to see how that affects Ruth here in just a moment. So as we continue, still in verse 1, "So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there for about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband." Let me just pause for a moment and so to make sure we're kind of following what's happened here. This was a Jewish family made up of a husband and a wife and 2 sons. Because of the famine, they were forced to go to Moab. Now, Moab is, these people are not Israelites now. The Moabites were actually enemies to the Jews for many years, and they were foreigners. But it was for survival. This Jewish family moved out of Israel, out of Palestine, and into Moab, surrounded by Moabites. Now, Israelites had been told by God forever that they were not to intermarry with other nations. And the reason was that if they intermarried, they might begin to worship the gods of these other nations. And they were always to worship Jehovah, only Jehovah. So they were told not to marry other people. But these 2 boys married Moabite women, which really was not right for them to do as Jewish men. But imagine they felt like they had no choice. They were living in Moab. At that point, they probably thought, this famine could go on forever. We may never get back to Israel. If I'm ever going to have a wife and children, this is my only chance. So they married Moabite women. After about 10 years of being married to those women, the 2 sons died. It doesn't tell us why her husband Elimelech died or how the 2 boys died, but now we have 3 widows. There's Naomi and Orpah and Ruth. All 3 are widows. And they're in a bad situation. In their culture, in those days, they couldn't survive. They really couldn't prosper. So you will see what happens in verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, meaning, by the way, that God had come to the aid of the Jews in Israel by lifting the famine. Rain came, the crops were harvested, so the people back in Israel had food now. When she heard this, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. Well, it was Naomi's home, not theirs, but they prepared to return to Naomi's home, which is Israel. Verse 7, with her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Now, her daughters-in-law are going to accompany her back to the border. But once they get to the border, Naomi is going to dismiss them, and you'll see what happens when she does in verse 8. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant each of you that you will find rest in the home of another husband." This is Naomi's very unselfish grant to them. She's releasing them from their responsibility to her as their mother-in-law. She's saying that you have no future. If you come with me into Israel, you have no future because no Israelite man is going to marry you. You're Moabite women. Your only hope is to go back to Moab and hope to find another husband where you can have children and have a family and have somebody who can provide for you. That's the best for you, and because she loved them, she was releasing them and sending them back to Moab. And it says, as we continue in verse 9, then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again, and then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Let's pause just once again. I want you to notice that Orpah made the logical choice. She went back to Moab, where she had a chance to remarry and have children and have a husband. We don't know what happened to her. We never hear her name again. Well, we kind of do, because there's a rather famous person in our society who's named after her. But her parents actually misspelled it when they did it, but they were literally trying to name Oprah after Orpah, and they switched 2 letters around. And so that's why we don't watch the Orpah show and have Orpah magazines, but that's actually the truth. But we never heard of the original Orpah again. Once she goes back to Moab, we never hear from her again. And when she does that, Ruth doesn't go with her. Ruth is clinging to Naomi, and Naomi is trying to reason with her and says, "Look at your sister-in-law, Orpah. She's made the right choice, the logical choice. You should go with her." And you'll see Ruth's answer has become one of the most well-known verses in all of the Bible, here in verse 16. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back with you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Now, I want you to understand what Ruth did with those words that she spoke. They're so eloquent, they're so beautiful, that you might actually miss what she's doing when she says these words. She just sacrificed any chance that she had for a future. She laid down her life, which would have been back in Moab. She laid down her future, her chance of getting married and having children and having a husband to care for her. She gave all of that up so that she could become a servant to her mother-in-law. You might say she made herself nothing and put Naomi's needs ahead of her own. Ruth didn't do anything great in the world's eyes when she made that statement. What she did was a very small thing that would have gone unnoticed by anybody except for Naomi. She put Naomi's needs ahead of her own. You know, we're all told to do that. Paul says, put others' needs ahead of your own, but it's something that, quite frankly, very few people do in real life. She really did that, and it was a small thing, but it was significant in the eyes of God. Many people strive for significance. You know, you'll hear people say, "I want to be somebody." I remember a comedian, I think it was Paula Poundstone, who said when she was young, she said she asked God to make her, she told God she wanted to be somebody, and then later as an adult she realized she should have been more specific. Always thought that was clever. But everybody wants to be, most people want to be somebody. Little kids grow up and they watch shows like American Idol, and they dream that someday that's going to be them standing on the stage, and everybody's going to be clapping, and the confetti is going to be falling, and they're going to be the American Idol. The little children watch athletes, great athletes who hit the big home run or slam dunk or score the touchdown, and they dream that they're going to be that great athlete. Kids want to be the best actor in the best-selling movies, and they all dream of fame and doing these big things. So many people do. When I was a young pastor and the church started to grow rapidly, I thought maybe this will just keep growing, and it'll just grow out of control, and it'll be like one of those big mega churches, and then I'll be invited to speak at these big conferences, and someday I'll be giving the inaugural speech at the inauguration of President Trump. No, I didn't really think that, of course. Thank you, Lord. But those things happen to pastors as well as anybody else. You know, you think, I think every young pastor sees a church and thinks, maybe God's going to cause this to grow, and then I'm going to be significant. It happens to everybody, thinking that to do something big, you have to be famous. You have to do something big to be significant. Jesus said, if you want to be significant in my kingdom, follow my example. And he gets down on his knees and he washes the feet of the disciples. And he says, now if you want to be significant in my kingdom, you go out and you be a servant to others. You lower yourself and you serve other people. That's how you get to be significant in my kingdom. It's exactly the opposite of our world that says we have to lord it over others. We have to have lots of people serving us. Then we're significant. We have to have a lot of people applauding us and looking to us. Then we're significant. Jesus says, no. The more people you serve, the more significant you are. So Ruth put Naomi's needs ahead of herself. You know, Albert Einstein said, only a life lived for others is a life worthwhile. Pretty smart guy, wasn't he? Only a life lived for others is a life worthwhile. The problem with so many of the famous people is that the more famous they get, the more self-absorbed they become. And their life is all lived for themselves. And a life lived for yourself, no matter how famous you are, is an empty life. And we've seen countless stories of people who've gained all the fame in the world only to find that they're completely empty inside. But Naomi didn't do that. Ruth didn't do that. She put Naomi's needs ahead of herself. Now, realize Ruth was facing a crisis. Her husband died. She's got no means of caring for herself. And she's going into a foreign country where she has no chance of getting a husband. She's facing a crisis. Now, sometimes when we face a crisis, we kind of justify our selfishness. When you lose your job or you have a health crisis, for example, your marriage is falling apart, we can sort of justify becoming self-absorbed. Well, it's just, I have to survive. It's about me. I've got to do what I have to do. And we put our needs ahead of everybody else. Ruth was facing a crisis, and she didn't become self-absorbed. She put Naomi's needs ahead of herself. The logical thing to do would be to follow Orpah and go back to Moab. But something happened to Ruth that did not happen to Orpah, her sister-in-law. And that is that Ruth bonded with the living God. She gave up the false gods of Moab, and she embraced the one true God of Israel. She said to Naomi, not only your people will be my people, she said, your God will be my God. Orpah never seemed to grasp that, but Ruth did. And Ruth clung to the living true God. You see, the unselfish decision that she made to sacrifice everything for Ruth, that was her salvation. If she had done the normal, logical thing to meet her own needs, she would have gone back to a false god in Moab. But because she made herself nothing and served Ruth, she grasped hold of the true God, Jehovah, and that was her salvation. That was her conversion when she said, your God will be my God. She became a servant of the living God. It was the most significant decision she ever made. And guess what? God lifted her up. You know, he says, if you humble yourself, I will lift you up. God lifted up Ruth. God brought her a wonderful husband against all odds, because Jews will not marry a Moabite woman, but he brought her a wonderful husband who not only provided for her, but also gave her children. And she had children. And she had grandchildren. And she had great-grandchildren. In fact, her great-grandson is named Jesse. You may not remember Jesse, but you'll know his son. Her grandson was Jesse. Her great-grandson was named David, who would become the king. And do you realize that because her great-grandson was David, it means that she is in the line of Jesus. And so the name of Ruth, a Moabite woman with nothing to her name, she received the honor of being placed in the genealogy of the Messiah, the Savior of the world. She is listed in the genealogy in your Bible as in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. In fact, it's fair to say that her life literally led to Jesus, and that makes her significant. She didn't try to make herself significant. She did something very small, but God lifted her up and made her significant. In her lifetime, she was insignificant by the world's standards, but right now, and in the world's scope and in heaven right now, she's a superstar. She's in a very rare air in that small group of people who are in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So what we can learn from this is, don't be discouraged if your life is small. Don't think that small things are not significant. You might say to yourself, well, all I did was go visit some elderly person who was lonely. Or all I did was offer a drink of water to someone who was thirsty. Or all I did was give a can of soup to somebody who was hungry. These things are just small things. I used to think that you had to do big things to be significant, to be great. But I now believe that the greatest things that we do are small things that are done for God. Let's pray together.